Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Yeah, thanks to be back. So we're recording this on April 2nd, 2022.
The devastating war in the Ukraine continues, and we remain inspired by the courage and sacrifice of the Ukrainian people as they fight for their families, their countries, and their right to self-determination. We begin this episode by looking at a question that many people have been asking. Why is the price of gas so high, and what can be done about it? We then discuss the latest updates on the Russia-Ukraine war, including the recent negotiations held in Turkey, how the Russian economy is doing, and the recent sanctions activity. Finally, does Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations help us understand the war and why it remains so popular today?
So, getting started, Anita has actually been gone for some time. She was at a conference in Honolulu, Hawaii, which she conveniently scheduled to escape the last kind of winter period here in the DC area.
I came back, it was like 32 degrees, so I didn't quite escape it.
She didn't quite time it perfectly, but she still missed some pretty icy, windy sort of conditions. So how was your time in Honolulu?
Yes, so I was there for the Association of Asian Studies annual conference, and it was such a hardship that they decided to have it in Honolulu this year, I must say. You're not laughing? That's like complete irony. I'm
jealous. I mean, you were gone for a week in sunny paradise.
So this was my first time at this conference, and I wanted to go and see what the latest was in the Asian kind of literature scholarship. And a lot of this conference was very humanities focused. So there was a lot of history and literature and anthropology, but there was still some focus on sort of political and economic topics. And, when it comes to China, I would say the mood there is so much like it is everywhere in a worrisome way. The emphasis was still on China's aggressiveness, particularly military aggressiveness, and how it's going to take over Taiwan any day now, or certainly in the near future. And economics won't deter it. So one of presentation I remember listening to, he worked for some Department of Defense, and he was reading like statements from the Chinese Communist Party and said that, the reunification is not just a goal, it's critical for how the Chinese think about where they want to be as a global power. But my counter to this is if China militarily invaded Taiwan, regardless of what military response we had, or even to the extent that we can harm them economically, then, but China loses its overall goal, which is to be a world power. So I think that was, if there's any place that I would think that I would hear more counterpoints, I'd almost think at a conference that had more emphasis on humanities.
Yeah, so enough about kind of the politics. What I want to hear is what's the sports bar scene like in Honolulu? Because you sat through two pretty big games for your Arkansas Razorbacks. How about you talk some about that experience and how receptive the native Honoluluans were to the pig suey battle cry that I'm sure you led everybody in.
No, I did not, because I'm not my dad. I did talk to everyone at the bar, but but I could not quite get up the... And besides, that comes up more in football than it does basketball, because they're always doing it.
I tend to say there's basketball games. You still have the Woo Pig Suey.
I know, but it didn't seem like the TV was covering it.
No, I think they did.
Mostly silent. So, yeah, it's obviously like not as good, fancy sports bars as you'd find in Los Angeles or Washington, D.C., because it's so tourist oriented. And emphasis on open air. Like no one in Hawaii wants to be in an enclosed space very much,
sure,
right?
yeah,
So the restaurants and everything, including the sports bars, are kind of as open as possible. But yeah, it was still, I mean, I found a couple good places to watch the game. And most of the people that were watching it at the bars with me were other tourists who were, wanting to catch some March Madness. But a couple links to Arkansas and one Hawaii native who was loudly cheering for Arkansas, which was fun. But I mean, his ties were that he bet on Arkansas.
There you go. It was a decent bet. They had a good chance.
But I was sitting next to this person who's very, very nice, but he was rooting for Duke. He lives in North Carolina. And, obviously...
Did he actually go to Duke or?
No. He just lives...
Brother. It's just a bandwagon.
He lives in Cary.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. All right.
And so, like, at the point in the second quarter where I was like, this game is over, like, we just can't. He was like, no, you guys are still in it. He was, like, really nice, even though, like, he was cheering. Actually, there's not a lot of times that you sit and talk to strangers. And I kind of surprised myself by the need to talk to strangers while sitting at the bar.
Yeah. Well, you're cheering your team there. I mean, you had that connection and excited and open. And
I learned about people's life stories, though, because that's what all those timeouts you're talking about. So. Oh,
yeah. Yeah.
So I felt a little bit like my dad because I had to talk to everybody and learn their life stories.
Yeah, no, it sounds a little bit like your dad. Yeah.
But not on the crazy end. I could not bring myself to do the whoop-pitsui.
Yeah. And we won't be taking vacations with those people the next couple of years that you met at the bar.
That's the one amazing thing that happened to my dad. Yeah, exactly. No, none of that. So no, it was a really good trip. The weather was really nice. And then it was really hard to come back, especially when I left DC, it was in the 50s. So I didn't bring a coat of any kind. And so when I landed, I hadn't even checked the weather. And so when I landed here, and, on the plane, the captain was like, oh, it's currently 25 degrees and it'll be 32 degrees when we land. I'm like, I have to stand to get a taxi. Like, I'm going to freeze to death. Fortunately, the taxi line was short, but it was really cold because it just had like a light sweater that I'd worn on the plane.
Oh, yeah. 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 It's a big shock to the system coming back for sure.
All right. Well, let's go on to the show. And, you hear this question repeatedly. If I happen to mention what your job is, this question comes up to me. So, and I think the media has done a terrible job of really explaining it. So really, the first question that I wanted to open with for you is, why are the gas prices so high? And in particularly, why do they climb so fast the immediate time that the price of oil goes up? But then they don't decline at the same rate. So why is that?
Yeah, so this is a question from our last episode. So I did a little bit of research and came across some information back from 2008, 2010, the last time that this happened, and people complained about gas prices, and then oil prices then fell in 2009, but gas prices still stayed kind of high. So it's a whole phenomenon known as pass-through effect. So you have a change in the oil price, and then ultimately it affects the gas price because oil price affects about 70% of the gas price. The rest is made up of taxes primarily. And that's going to vary by location to location. But yeah, the whole phenomenon, the fact that it shoots up super fast when oil prices go high, and then it comes down much slower is this whole phenomenon known in the industry, kind of the downstream side, and by economists as the rockets and feathers. So the idea rockets up and then kind of floats back down. And it's really driven by two different things. One is the seller market power. So how much power does the retail gas station have kind of locally within its area? So if you're in a rural part of the country and there's one gas station or two gas stations within 10 square miles, they're going to have a lot of pricing power. So they're absolutely going to shoot that price up when the oil signals that. and then is going to be very slow coming down. Now, in more urban areas where maybe you have multiple gas stations on a single street, it's going to be more competitive and more responsive over time. The other effect is just the supply chain shock. So this we definitely saw with the Ukraine, with the fact that you had a restriction in supply, and definitely we see that with the Russian oil tankers that have lacked sailors. Now that's changing now. You're finding more sailors, particularly in India and probably in the future with China. But at least over the past month, there's definitely been this huge supply shock. So what refiners do, because there's a limited amount of supply, they'll preemptively raise prices in order to suppress demand. So you have this combination effect of kind of at the local retail level, depending on their market pricing power, individual gas stations, taking advantage of the situation, and then refiners reacting to a restriction in supply and available supply and trying to deal with that by suppressing demand through those increases in prices. So it's a complicated phenomenon. There's numerous economists that have papers that have studied it, but in general, the correlation that existed back then, and I haven't checked it to see if it's true, just kind of the ballpark, but for every $10 rise in the price of a barrel of oil, it's correlated with about a 25 cents increase in the price of a gallon of gasoline. So that's the long-range relationship, and it'll always go back to that long-range relationship, but this pass-through effect, that's where you see the disconnect over time.
So the local gas stations are taking advantage of this to increase their profits.
Yeah, and economists have looked at that, and part of it is there is an initial lack of responsiveness with the consumer in terms of maybe it's just more convenient on that side of the road to stop at a particular gas station, so you're not as price responsive, or you're not filling up the tank as frequently, so you're not responding to those price signals. So they're absolutely going to take advantage of that, especially with the lack of competition. And it's all very locally based and all of that. They're not going to bring down their prices unless their competitor brings down those prices.
So I think it's really helpful. And some part of the discussion that I never hear is this emphasis on, local prices, local gas stations. I don't think that people realize how individually these are owned by people in the community. But another question or comments that definitely come on the left, but also part of the mainstream is this just an example of oil companies themselves profiteering from the war? Taking the advantage of the situation with Ukraine to drive up prices and profits.
Yeah, so ultimately, it all goes back to the fact that, oil itself is a global commodity. So because it's such a competitive market and environment, there's really no ability beyond OPEC itself to have kind of a ability to restrict supply, to drive up prices. It's the decisions of individual private firms, which are driven by the demands of shareholders and individual investors.
So when you say private firms, are you talking about the oil companies, or are you talking about investment firms?
No, both. Well, when I say private, I say not state-owned, so not
Okay.
the OPEC operators. So they're either publicly traded within financial markets, or they're privately held by private capital.
So they are trying to increase their profits. They do take advantage of this.
I think you have to look at it. Well, one, it goes back to, and we've talked about this before. So over the period of the last 10 years, there's been a change in investor philosophy and strategy, especially within the U.S. oil and gas sector. When the fracking boom first occurred in the mid-2000s, the emphasis was on growth above all else. So investors absolutely and rewarded management teams to grow their oil production, drill as many wells as possible, stake out acreage positions, and just grow. And that's what they were rewarded and incentivized for. Now, unfortunately, that decision with the oil price collapse and then a period of over-drilling, so just putting too many wells in too close of an area led to massive losses for those same investors. So what you've seen over the last 3 years is a complete shift in investment strategy where it's all about free cash flow, about profitability. And in that case, because of this emphasis on profitability over growth, that really restrains, in terms of what the individual companies can do. It's because they've lost billions and billions of dollars over the last, say, like 5 to 10 years. It's been extraordinarily poor investment, especially compared to other sectors of the economy. And investors now rightfully see, hey, this is a time to make up for that. Now, there'll still be, price signals. They stay high enough, they're absolutely going to drill because they're going to be able to pay out those wells within, 6 months or so.
So the other sentiment on this that I see has been, well, okay, who cares about rich people trying to recoup some profits that they may have lost? Like, they still were making money. This is just rich people, but it's affecting day-to-day Americans. Mm-hmm. So why do these companies, particularly as it's being affected by the war, like, why is there no response to how it's affecting ordinary Americans? And should they have some patriotic obligation to temporarily cut their profits in order to make gas still affordable during this war period?
And it's something that this certainly came up in periods of war and like World War II. But I would say we operate and the industry operates under a free market capitalist system. It has zero obligations for patriotic reasons. That's the role of government. If it is in the nation's interest, then the government should intervene, as it did during World War II, and invoke something along the lines of the War Powers Act. And in fact, you've seen that reflected and we'll post a link to it. I think it was an article in The Atlantic that, essentially saying, yeah, oil companies could do more. And under a system similar to the War Powers Act of the 1940s, the federal government can come in and say, you will prioritize this U.S. government contract to drill more wells on federal lands. Oil companies would be perfectly fine with that because the U.S. taxpayer would take the risk of drilling those wells and provide that capital up front and then, get reimbursed essentially through production. So, but that's when you invoke patriotism, when you invoke national interest, that's the role of the government, not the role of the private sector.
So as devil's advocate, so why is Biden not doing this? And is this just like part of his green energy initiative to not want this drilling on federal lands? And isn't this some failing of the federal government right now?
Yeah, no, I assume he would get massive pushback. I mean, it's funny because ideologically, the Republican Party is so far from its roots. But I mean, this is the ultimate in kind of business interference into a sector. When the government comes in and tells a sector, I don't care about your profit motives. I care about you producing this commodity that we need more of right now. So it's big government interference, without a doubt. So I don't see Biden doing that. I mean, I think you certainly see more pro-industry sort of sentiments. And, you sent the Secretary of Energy to the big conference in Houston 2 weeks ago, the Sierra Conference, basically to urge producers. But in terms of taking a more direct approach, yeah, we're not there yet. This isn't World War II.
Yeah. I mean, I, of course, agree with all that. The other final question I have about this is what about Biden's decision, kind of a historic decision, it seems like, to release continuously these barrels?
Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Yeah, so that's the one thing, I mean, the federal government can easily do. And I have no doubt that's what the Department of Energy, in terms of viable solutions, what it can do. So it does help bridge the gap. So it's, I think, 1 million barrels a day release. You're assuming that roughly 2 million barrels is currently off of the market compared to the pre-war condition just because of the displacement of Russian oil. So it definitely, especially if it's coordinated with the Chinese and other people that has petroleum reserves, you will have to replenish that. And it's certainly outside of the conditions of what it was meant for, which is more of a natural disaster and direct war. But, over a 6-month period, I think it's 180 million out of the 500 plus million barrels. So there's still significant reserves available. But yeah, refilling that, I don't see the oil prices dropping soon. So it may be kind of a costly decision.
I'm inclined to agree, but what do you think the effect will be on gas prices for Americans? Will this make a difference?
I think it'll definitely help keep the upward pressure. The key is that we are, and this came up in the analysis by the around the pass-through, is you have seasonal impacts. Obviously, we're reaching the summer, Memorial Day. That's always a period where, Americans are driving more. Gas prices tend to go up during this period. So does it help keep some of that seasonality effect limited? I mean, oil prices definitely responded to that announcement. I think dropped a good 5-7%. But whether that sticks or not is unclear.
Okay, well, I think we covered that issue. So the recent news about Russia and Ukraine has been on the negotiations held in Turkey a few days ago, and there have been mixed reactions. So I saw that in some of the mainstream media, I kind of hate that word, but kind of fits the sentiment as they were reporting on this was optimistic. But then when I was looking at some of the think tanks, very non-ideological think tanks, their work was this, the only success you could claim from this was the fact that they were meeting together, and that doesn't seem like very much success or optimism. The demands are pretty much the same and far apart at this point.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But it was interesting to see in greater detail what the Ukrainian side was proposing as successful. Now, they're going to come, obviously, at the beginning of a negotiation as more of their maximalist hopes. And essentially what they're saying is, we won't join NATO, but we want a security guarantee that's the equivalent of the Article 5 of the NATO's charter with U.S., Turkey, European nations, China. I was surprised was listed on here. I guess they're still, maybe this is Ukraine's request. I know next week they're going to talk directly with all of these counterparties and bring them into the negotiation as part of this security arrangement. But yeah, so I thought that was interesting. And then the 15-year time frame to negotiate around Crimea. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I thought that may be the most interesting part of it. But the counterpoint to everything you're saying is, how can we say anything optimistic or successful until Russia actually declines military activity? And that hasn't happened out of this or any other negotiations.
Yeah. And that's exactly. And definitely Biden and Blinken both expressed that sentiment that it's really actions that count with the Russians, that they've proven themselves to be completely untrustworthy negotiation partners. And it's not clear whether it's the battlefield losses that are forcing them to pull back from Kiev and certain areas in the central part of the country, and then this new alignment towards Donbass and creating that land bridge between that and the Crimea.
I still feel a little skeptical, but I don't know, maybe we will see some progress in the future if Russia will really shift its military activity, I think mostly based on lack of success. But if they did, then that kind of creates more room for negotiations too.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it remains to be unseen whether this is just a tactic to essentially kind of regroup and replenish all the issues that they've been having.
All right. So, because of all my traveling, all of this, I have to say, is sort of I've been catching up on and just kind of monitoring some takes from Twitter. But I was kind of surprised, sort of when you brought it up, and then when I looked it up, this idea that the Russian economy is recovering from the sanctions. And I was surprised because it certainly, my sources had been emphasizing, whether it's The Economist or NPR Planet Money, the dramatic losses the Russian economy has taken. So this particular take surprised me a lot.
Yeah, and I think it really focuses around the recovery, almost the complete recovery of the Russian ruble. When the crisis first started, it dropped about 70%. It was a very dramatic loss. It was something that Biden in his speeches would often kind of point out as, we turned the ruble into rubble. But since that time, it's recovered almost the entirety of its value. And I thought Paul Krugman in the New York Times, I think when he's sticking to economics target, he's very good. Political, not so much, but economics, very good. So he kind of explained it as it's really the aggressiveness of the Russian central bank in order to defend the ruble. So they did a couple different things. So one was they raised the key interest rate from 9.5% to 20%. So huge increase. And then implemented extensive capital control. So what does that mean? That means the Russian citizens themselves can't take money out of the country to foreign banks, and then foreign investors can't exit their positions in Russian assets. The other thing that's helping is obviously the higher oil and gas prices, because that's not under a sanction regime, has helped support some of that national revenue coming in. But I think what the interesting take that Krugman had is that, the central bank can do, several different things. And one of them is the defense of the currency, but that's taken precedence over the economy itself. Because normally you wouldn't raise interest rates when your economy is plunging into a recession or depression. That's just going to further deter economic activity. But if you relate it more to its political or propaganda value, that makes more sense, because the economic data, can be easily suppressed, or it's months out. So it's not something you have to worry about immediately. But the ruble and the currency exchange rate, that's something everybody sees every day. So it's a very visible sort of indication for Russian citizens. So the thought is that, sacrifice everything in order to support the ruble. And that has been successful, but the underlying economy itself is still deeply damaged. And obviously, this doesn't help the economy for the average citizen. In fact, the projections are still the Russian GDP could contract as much as 15%, which is absolutely devastating. But at the same time, I think because of the optics of the ruble, this has pushed both the US and Europe to think more aggressively on further sanctioning. So that's why you had the Treasury Department come out on Thursday, talked about new sanctions, really targeting the military supply chain and some of the technology companies. So it may end up, backfiring on Russia even more, kind of this severe defense, because again, it's so visible that they can say, the sanctions we've successfully fended off the worst of the West economic war against us.
So one thing I think, sort of in reference to what you were just saying, that Krugman does really well here is explaining the impossible trinity, which is just crucial to understanding currency flows. And sort of as you said, it's called the impossible trinity because the ideal would be if you could have all three of these things, which would be stability of your currency in terms of other currencies, the free movement of funds across its borders, so you would not have capital controls, and freedom from monetary action, so the ability to raise interest rates in recession. But you can only have two of these because, in particular, if you want stability of the value of your currency, and if you want to have the freedom to cut interest rates, then you have to have capital controls. Or you can, in the West, you can not have capital controls, but then the stability of your currency depends on the market, right? And so, but the thing that I think he actually misses a little bit in his argument is that because Russia cannot access US dollars and euros, that even their idea of this currency being like, this is how you would convert the currency to dollars or euros, is nothing really more than an illusion because you can't trade them at all, right? It's not even about, controlling your country's ability to invest in other countries or whether you accept that investment in. But if you literally cannot trade rubles to dollars, then whatever you say that price is doesn't mean anything at all because you can't actually trade rubles to dollars. So this idea that it has recovered in price is pretty meaningless.
Yeah. So you're in basic agreement that it's not a indicator at all of Russian economic recovery, but just kind of the limitations of what they could do.
Not only does it not say anything about the Russian economy, it just doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, but there's still economic activity and trade with India, with China, with
not in dollars.
Yeah, but it didn't just drop against those currencies. It dropped against all currencies. It reflected the overall weakness of the Russian economy.
So, you definitely make a good point there about the yuan to ruble conversion, but there's a couple different other things at stake there, which is one of the totality of trade. That's still a relatively small amount. And two, China also has strict capital controls. So you have two fixed currencies that are being defined in relation to each other. So it's not a really important indicator. It certainly does not suggest much about the Russian economy.
Yeah, I think we're in total agreement there that the movement, the recovery of the ruble against the dollar is meaningless about the underlying strength or the effect of sanctions on the economy. So people shouldn't be concerned about that. What it may raise, be interesting to get your take, is, will it cause the West to overreact? Because I think one of the interesting points of a debate that's going on within Germany is really seriously considering, can they cut themselves completely off of Russian gas in the short term? And there is this, you have groups of economists that the one that the government employed is essentially saying this will be devastating. Even if we can do it, it's going to cause a massive recession within Germany. Obviously, all the industrial, the big chemical companies that depend on cheap gas as input. But then you have another group of economists, and we'll provide a link to the article. I think this is detailed in The Economist, that say, hey, this is going to result in, even with a complete loss, we'll be able to find replacements, and it should have a 3% impact on GDP. And we just went through an event with coronavirus that was a 4.5%, and we were able to bear it. So there's this legitimate debate going on in Germany, of all places, between, can we, just because there's enough moral outrage about what's going on in the Ukraine from kind of a bottoms-up level, I'd be shocked if they arrived at any decision that actually sanctions Russian energy imports. But I think just the fact that they're talking about it, and maybe this whole sentiment of, wow, we've got to be even tougher on them because, hey, look at the ruble.
Right. So I don't have a detailed list of sources, but the reaction that I've seen is sort of, wow, this is really interesting that Germany is talking about this. It's gone from like a 0% possibility to like a 2% possibility. It's highly, highly unlikely. But the fact that they're having that debate is interesting. And another way just of viewing this, I think we're jumping ahead in the outline, but I kind of wondered if we shouldn't jump ahead on this too, goes to this question of, so Russia is transporting through its sea lanes half of what it was in the beginning of March. And the question is, well, why is that? Couldn't, the U.S. had a very small amount and they stopped it, but why then isn't China or India? So basically, you could have in the market, you could have this whole redirection of flows where the countries that were getting oil from Russia buy more from the Middle East, and then countries like China that were getting their part of the oil that was coming from the Middle East, they would buy from China. So you don't have this big disruption in price. And that was the thinking of some economists. One thing that we've talked about is grades are not equal. And so that's one of the problems with having that direct market. But, I was reading that this whole currency issue, as well as other technical problems. So, the thing is, why are they not buying oil? So Russian oil is heavily discounted right now at $31 a barrel. India has been taking advantage of this to a small extent, but they really can't replace much of that lost oil selling. So it would have to be China. Well, so there are some complications for China in doing this. So one, also in replacing flows, it is harder to transport oil to China than it is to Europe. So that shipping route, it only takes 3 to 4 days to ship oil to Europe. But I was pretty shocked when I read that it takes 40 days for Russia to ship oil to China and Asia, just due to the nature of the tankers and other technical requirements. This is another point. China can't trade with Russia in dollars directly because then it goes against the banking sanctions. And they worry about if they had these large amounts, then Chinese banks would be subject to secondary sanctions, right? So the only way to really have payment is either you use rubles or they use Chinese banks to receive payment in yuan. And to the extent that Russia wants to do that is a question. And so that's why you have 2 million barrels per day of Russian oil that is not being bought. It's out there that is not being bought. There's a sense that eventually Russia discounts it enough that, it makes up for these hurdles and becomes a good bargain for for China. But I think this is certainly a really important part that people don't understand with China still selling its oil and why it might lose incentive or it might try to use its leverage against Europe if it doesn't feel like it's immediately getting that economic benefit.
Yeah, no, the frozen bank account where you can't access those payments to essentially service your economy.
And you can't even trade dollars with China, right? That's the thing.
Yeah.
You can't sell your oil out to China or India to get dollars.
Right. Well, why is India? Because India, I saw in that same article, their oil purchases from Russia have shot way up. So obviously they've run a little different calculus. I know the U.S. has been increasing and the West has been increasingly critical of India and kind of its position. But have you read any kind of what India's calculus? Why the Chinese are a lot more cautious, but the Indians have immediately said, hey, this $31 a barrel discount, this looks pretty good to us.
Do not have detailed information, but one thing about with this oil purchases is that Indian oil purchases in general could never make up this market. Like you would have to have China. It's the only one that could create the economic size.
Yeah, that has the spare storage capacity and refining
capacity. So even though India
yeah.
is increasing, it's not really going to make this
From
much of a dent,
base.
Right?
Yeah.
The only part of the economy that could really change this dynamic is China. India and Russia is such an interesting dynamic and one that I'm trying to read up a little bit more on. I met another fellow in a different area of SACE at the conference in Hawaii, and he had just mentioned, and we didn't have a chance to get into the details, but he mentioned that, there's no way that you're going to break India apart from Russia. They're just too intertwined. And unfortunately, I can't follow up with exactly why that is, but that's what I'm hearing from.
So beyond the obvious, what we talked about last time about the military, the fact 90% of their military equipment comes from Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So beyond that,
there's
other ties.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So I just thought that was a really interesting comment. It also reflected on that I still don't understand this relationship, but this is how important the relationship is to India.
Yeah, I get. They were even though they were part of the non-aligned, they were much more aligned with the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they definitely had cultural exchange. Indian students go. Of course, the U.S. has that as well. So I think that's probably the disappointment is that we thought we had made a lot more inroads in the last 20, 30 years in India. But, I get the military, but that's really interesting that there's other ties beyond that kind of.
Yes. And if I've obviously been busy traveling and trying to catch up on work when I've gotten back here. So if I ever get time to really look into that relationship more, I do want to talk about it.
In a year, we're going to have time for direct field study since we'll be going to India next March.
Oh, that's true.
That's right.
That is our trip there is an interesting topic for another episode. But so that's we have these cultural exchanges, we're not going to stop them, right? We are still, nothing that India does is going to stop the importance of what the United States wants its ties with India.
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah.
So they're not losing anything. Like, also, why would they break these ties? Not only is his comment that you couldn't get them to break their ties, but they have no incentive to do that right now because the U.S. is going to place just as important of a relationship with India. You know, it wants the whole Quad, alliance to counter Russia. It, wants to have a democracy.
The incentive is how badly the Russian military equipment performs. I'd be worried about that if I'm going up against Chinese technology or hell stuff that we've supplied to Pakistan.
I guarantee you they already know that because they're using that equipment on these border skirmishes with the Chinese.
Well, yeah, but not full armor. I mean, these are all like small little skirmishes. I mean, that one with China was like they were fighting not baseball bats or cricket bats, but it was hand-to-hand combat.
Right. There's no sign that they
I'm
would
just saying
escalate
in a real
beyond
war, that would be the incentive to
Okay, but India does
from
not
Russian
anticipate
military.
being in a real war with China.
They do with Pakistan. I mean,
Yeah, well, that's different.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like
a little bit more of an edge.
I don't understand what that has to do with the possibility of war with China.
No, I'm just saying the incentive for India to de-link from Russia because, until I read more, I'm thinking a lot of it is the military and just how dependent their military is on Russian supply and equipment. But seeing its performance in the battlefield, again, I mean, it's not like this is the first time Russian equipment's performed badly. Maybe that creates incentive to be brought into the Quad military-industrial supply complex.
Well, I think they do want that, but it takes time and training.
Some discounts, too. I think it's cost as well.
Yeah, of course. And training. I mean, it's going to be extraordinarily expensive to buy into U.S. technology and train for it.
Starting with the French stuff. I mean,
I've never heard anyone propose that as an alternative. So that's why. I mean, they're not a particularly rich economy. So again, we definitely just have a lot of discounts for a lot of countries that we see value in the military alliance. But it also would require training. And even in those other countries that, like with Egypt and where we give enormous amount of, military aid, I mean, they're still also using Russian equipment as well.
Yeah. It comes down to that price point. But yeah, I think, as the Quad, you hold more joint training activities and things like that. Maybe that's over time. And, India before COVID was growing. It was the fastest growing economy, a good 7% clip. It's been hit pretty badly with COVID, but it'll certainly move up the economic tables over time.
Yeah, people are also disappointed, though, in the democratic sliding back for India, which we've talked about, but it's certainly been something I've seen just cursorily trying to read some articles about this. So that's definitely not going to happen in any time where that it affects this war with Ukraine. And, and I think, we talked about it, but it's just this really important context too, is that other countries in different regions of the world do not see this conflict, at all in the same way. I was talking yesterday to a PhD student who was from Nigeria, I believe. And, she was saying, if I was in charge of foreign policy, I would take a firmly neutral stance because I just see this as a conflict between the United States and Russia. And, I need to focus on how to help my economy and my growth and strengthening my institutions. And there's no incentive for my country to take, a stand in either side. So again, this really just goes to, we see this and it's break in what we have felt the international order is, a country trying to take over land in another country, right? But also, from an African standpoint in other regions, that happens, right? Like it doesn't get any attention, but that's already happening on the continent. So they don't have the same sense of the world order. And we certainly have not done anything to try to enforce that ideal in Africa. So our final topic is one of my favorites. Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, which gets brought out a lot every once in a while. And it's my favorite topic because I like talking about how I feel like it makes no sense and my disappointment that people use this argument over and over again. But first, I think I want to summarize very briefly about what his thesis is, and then Ryan will talk about the articles that have come up trying to say, oh, this has some value in explaining the war. So quite broadly, Samuel Huntington wrote this at the end of the Cold War, and it kind of countered Fukuyama's liberal idea that you would go on to see an increase in liberal democracy, less war, essentially. I mean, those are very naive descriptions, but that is sort of how it's portrayed. And Huntington did not see a sense that there would be decreasing conflict. He just felt that conflict would shift. So he felt like it would not be primarily an ideological conflict like you'd seen between Russia and the US, sort of over communism and democracy. And it wouldn't be primarily economic, that you would see divisions. The dominating source of conflict will be cultural. So what does he define as culture? And civilizations, according to him, are differentiated from each other by history, language, culture, tradition, and most importantly, religion. This is really fundamental to understand what Huntington is actually saying is, dividing these civilization divides over religion. In fact, trying to make these divides, he has trouble deciding whether Latin America is just part of the same civilization as the United States. So in that work, he kind of tends to say that it is. In his later work, he uses Roman Catholicism to say it's a separate civilization from the United States. So Huntington really depends on religion, and yet almost nobody discusses Huntington's thesis in terms of what he actually wrote about. So there were a couple articles that, as I mentioned, tried to bring this argument into saying that it helps explain or helps us understand the Russia-Ukrainian war. And since you brought these articles to my attention, kind of describe what they were trying to say.
Yeah, and I don't even know if it helped described in kind of that respect. I mean, I think the most direct was Ross Douthat, so the conservative op-ed columnist at the New York Times, wrote a piece saying that, the Clash of Civilizations wasn't perfect, but, it does explain kind of this divide between, especially, I think when you focus around the relationship between China and the US and West, and kind of seeing the response from countries around the world in relation to the Ukrainian issue. Personally, I didn't think the link was that great because, obviously religion really didn't play a role in it. I still see it being more ideologically oriented. So I don't quite get it. I read through the Huntington article.
Made you finally do that?
It was long, it's outdated. I thought all the religious arguments, I get why it was popular during this, with 9/11 and with radical Islam and things along those lines. But everything else around it, when you look around the world with the younger generations becoming more secularized across these civilizational boundaries, none of it really resonated except for, and even then, what the heck is he talking with China and religion? He puts in Confucianism as that, but Confucianism was suppressed by Mao forever. So all the traditional Chinese values were scrubbed out. And it's only recently it had a resurgence, but then with Xi, I feel like Mao's having a resurgence. So I'm like, okay, this whole framework just doesn't make any sense other than that, yes, there is a China-driven model of authoritarian autocracy.
But then it's ideological.
But then it's ideological. So I'm like, no, it's ideological divide. But because China is this nation state / civilization, and, put the West in with Western civilization. And then, okay, it's this clash between the two civilizations. That's the only part where I see some sort of connection, but ultimately it goes back to ideological reasons for the clash. I don't see this about religion between China and the United. That's ridiculous.
Of course. And so, he makes the prediction that there will be a peaceful reunification between China and Taiwan, right? Which makes sense if you're defining it in a sense of, right, not ideological conflict.
Yeah, and even moreover, he was like, well, eventually China will kind of envelop Japan in a peaceful manner along those civilizational lines as well. And so it's all ridiculous. I mean, Korea doesn't even get mentioned in this whole thing, but
I'm sure Koreans are outraged because
they're just part of Chinese civilization, I think, in his model.
Yes. Yeah, so it's a very poor explanation. A lot of people point that he was writing it to counter Fukuyama's vision, but I think he was also writing some of it to counter, Mersheimer's vision. He certainly directly responds to Mersheimer in his argument about NATO expansion being leading that was going to create this tension between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, because he's writing this in the 90s. So he makes several points saying that, while people say that about, Russia and Ukraine, there's going to be a war, that his predictions are not. He writes, if civilization is what counts, however, the likelihood of violence between Ukrainians and Russians should be low. And he also sees this being bound based on the fact that they're both Orthodox Christians and sort of makes sense on a lot of his general theory. So first of all, if you're going to invoke this for the Russia-Ukraine war, you've obviously not read the article, or you obviously didn't read it very closely. And, Ross points out, a lot of problems with Huntington's argument. I didn't even see an argument for how I didn't understand his argument at all, or I couldn't find his argument tying it to Huntington. The Atlantic article we'll have a link to did define it more in terms of U.S. China. Everybody wants to, this is the most common use of it. It comes up a lot, certainly as soon as we talked about a rising Chinese power. And it sounds good, I guess. But yes, one, it's not even fruitful to talk about this, but Confucianism, interestingly, it was suppressed by Mao, but Xi has made it trying to make it part of the national identity of China, while at the same time also raising Mao's statement. These are political tools, but it's certainly, there's no foundational. Japan couldn't be more secular if it tried. Extraordinarily secular.
Yeah.
Plus you have if you're talking about religion, you have Buddhism and Confucianism and Christianity
Shintoism.
now.
You're right. Yeah, Christianity huge in Korea. Yeah.
So it certainly doesn't make sense. And like I said, these conflicts do seem more on ideological grounds. If you believe Huntington, then you have to say, oh, well, Southeast Asia would all be wanting to be part of this Chinese civilization, which, to some extent, they were in the original.
Yeah, but then you have whole areas like Malaysia and Indonesia. They're predominantly Islamic that don't really... I don't even know why he would group them in there in the first place. It's kind of a mess. Also, I don't agree with the incompatibility. I think the quality of the democracies in Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea in terms of, legitimate opposition parties and kind of the growth that you've seen there, independent judiciary, all of that.
And a lot of that came at the end of the 90s, right?
After he wrote this article, yeah.
So to an extent that people criticized those democracies were kind of controversial because they did not have real opposition parties. They had not had a change in opposition. And this most happened in early 2000s for Korea and Japan, even though the democracy was strengthening before that. So there are legitimate reasons at the time of him writing, but it still didn't really make sense as an argument. And yeah. Huntington did great work in American politics on democratization, but in his latter works, these focus on religion. He went on to talk about the evils of migration from Latin America to the United States based on Roman Catholic work ethic versus Protestantism, or, some argument that people try to ignore. Even people who refer to class civilization would like to pretend that Huntington didn't write that. So I think people like the words. I think they like clash of civilization. I think they like this idea that China's creating a world order separate to the United States. They certainly don't question what a civilization means or how Huntington is defining it.
Yeah, that being said, I mean, I think the argument and the framing around culture, around religion, wherever the traditional values, I feel like this did seed a lot of the movement in the far right. I mean, kind of, if you look at what Bannon's framework when, he started out in the White House, and he's still, enormously popular podcast, the center of kind of far right discussion. But it was always framed as a civilizational struggle that our natural ally is Russia because they're strong Christians, they're strong traditional values, they naturally belong with what should be a reinvigorated West, after we get rid of these soft, liberal, multicultural values. But Russia's a natural, we need them in order to battle against the atheist heathen from China. So it was always framed in that. I felt like in terms of intellectual foundation that the Huntington work always kind of stood there, even without knowing the details till today. I always felt like, they're kind of grasping on to that. Obviously, the thing with 9/11 and the war against Islam, they had framed on it from that, but then this whole struggle against China, and then the idea that, of course, Russia's an ally. Of course they are. And look at Putin. He's such a strong leader. He's such a strong, co-religionist.
What they liked about Russia, and in that argument in general, one, Huntington makes these divides between Christianity. He really goes for the traditional divides, right? So he sets up, Russia and a lot of Eastern Europe as being distinct from Western civilization, being based on Orthodox Christianity, right? And he also, in his arguments, distinguishes between Catholicism and Protestantism.
Yeah, which I get. I love that. I love he goes back old school skiism, man. The original split between the East and Western churches is wild. Yeah.
Yeah, all three. Yeah. So he doesn't see Christianity necessarily as being unified. It's interesting how he interprets things. There are really two arguments about the West and why the West might want to keep Russia. And the sort of Bannon far right one is the newest, really, and is clearly not based on practicality So, they really highlight the authoritarian qualities about Putin that they like, right? That he crushes any definition of Christianity that does not adhere to their particular evangelical one.
And it's pushing it back against the excesses of Western wokeness. That's what they love about it, is he implements what they view as traditional values, so anti-homosexual, anti-trans.
The stronger argument, which we've talked about, is that why do you want to push Russia into Chinese arms, right? And that was more about really trying to address Russia's fears about security and trying to tie them into. So there's a legitimate argument there, but it's not at all this far right argument.
No, that's why we had all of these resets with Russia during Bush, during Obama. That's why at one point in the 90s, there was even talk of Russia joining NATO. There was a real attempt to bring them in because,
right?
Yeah, I think geopolitically it would make a lot of sense.
So it's interesting how Bannon and the far right they twist every argument. Even Huntington, which is a terrible argument. Everything Huntington wrote about religion, it's horrible, but it is still a stronger framework than how it's being twisted by the far right, which just twist it totally out of context. But the problem is it's not just the far right? Then people have just latched onto it. As I'm beginning, and I cannot say enough, this whole narrative framework of it's the West versus China, the strength of that. And people, I think, use the cost of civilizations out of context to support that narrative framing. And quickly about that, because, that's sort of how the Atlantic article sets it up too, is, all these arguments, so I think they're more ideological arguments, not necessarily civilization arguments between China. But they all say, this economic decoupling is going on between China and the West. And I keep looking up the numbers, and It's the opposite. I'm like, what? I hear it at the conferences. I hear everybody talking about this. And people will respond, well, there's the technology, military technology. Yeah, and that's a legitimate security thing, but that is not decoupling our economies. I hear about supply chains, people not willing to invest. But federal direct investment to China has been steadily increasing throughout these years at pretty dramatic rates. There might be a little bit less Europe and the United States, but that's being made up by Japan and South Korea. And there's actually just this real stability in who are the main investors in China. So I've looked these numbers up in every way. And there is no support for this decoupling thesis, even though you hear it everywhere. You hear it in the media, academics talk about it. And so there's the sense that China's creating this world order or it's making it self-sufficient from the global economy, but that's not what China wants. We have to keep remembering, at the conference, one person sort of did say this to come to a different conclusion than I would, but that our analysis of China is so much through this strategic prism as we view the world strategically. But we don't come from the question of what does China really want, right? So we look at it sort of as this, we have this world order and we think that China is creating this other order. But China is doing everything because it wants to be a global power. It's not like Russia. It doesn't get its power through the military, right? And, even its use of the military sort of follows the U.S. influence in the post-World War II era. Like, the U.S. was an economic giant long before it had a capable military. But its influence on the world, as many see it, increased dramatically when you also had a military to back that up. So China wants to be a power, right? I mean, I guess we already know that, but the things that we say then China is doing counters the idea of Chinese growing into being a world power.
In terms of decoupling and being self-sufficient, that doesn't... Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, only in maybe certain strategic areas would it want to be kind of sanction-proof. So in terms of military technology, AI, that's the whole... I mean, yeah, people theorize is like, yeah, that's why they want Taiwan because, that's the source of significant semiconductor manufacturing. And they have that, then they get shut off the world from alternative sources and...
So every time people counter with military technology and things like, yes, that makes sense. It makes sense that countries want to be self-sufficient. That doesn't really affect its integration into the economy. And
yeah, it's not big enough.
It has not,
part of the
right. It doesn't affect the numbers at all, right? Which are increasing.
Yeah, of course.
And yes, China does not want an economy cut off from the world. It wants the opposite, right?
Well, it's dependent on agriculture, raw commodities coming in as part of trade. I mean, it needs those. It needs to be part of the
global. And it's trying to transition more and more to a service economy, which is the kind of economy
to move up the value chain.
Right.
Yeah.
So many of these arguments make no sense to me, but they are just part of this popular narrative. And I just need to
I agree. I mean, you got to
that.
look at the numbers. I mean, yeah, there's always this. I bet even if you looked at on Western companies and kind of their diverse. I mean, I would like to see that. Have they, because you do hear, we're diversifying supply chains. And I get that to economic response because China's moved up the ladder and it's become more expensive that, they diversified some to Southeast Asia. But are they actively doing anything the last couple of years where there's been so much pressure and so much talk and so much?
Right. So I found this really interesting. So there's been some articles written recently, or at least written in 2022, discuss sort of, like Western companies are rethinking their investment in China. Again, their vulnerability, even in terms of COVID, their vulnerability in these supply chains. So I was curious about the numbers today about federal direct investment because I knew the trade numbers actually did completely not bear this effect. But I wanted to look at federal direct investment because I think it's really important. And it's certainly important in this discussion that Western companies are trying to avoid China for the supply chains, for the economic uncertainty and rules of such. So not only did I find, now this is kind of total numbers mostly, but this dramatic increase year over year from 2019 to 2020 to 2021, in the early months of 2022, that's what I found. You have, anywhere from 19% to 35% year over year increases, which is pretty dramatic. And as I said, US, European countries are not making as much of that investment, making up that portfolio percentage-wise, but they're still making up a huge part. And a lot of that is also then being filled in by Japan and South Korea, which, despite their conflicts, which are significant, and they have a lot of significant security conflicts with China, they are doubling down on foreign direct investment. Notably, China and Japan talk about decoupling foreign investment all the time, and they never do it. They always end up increasing it. Because again, we're talking about companies themselves, right? And I actually read a couple other interesting articles that maybe we'll talk about of how, even BRI, we just talk about this as the state government, but a lot of these are private companies, looking for investment opportunities. And we don't discuss that. And at least 70% of these investments. I read a really interesting article about how the private sector in the Chinese economy and how it is making up a larger part of the economy, not less. And it kind of a lot combating this sort of, that the state is increasing its role as becoming more of a state economy. But the actual facts do not bear that out and are sort of important. So those are the things that, we have to think about.
Yes, I think in conclusion, not a big fan of Mr. Huntington's work Clash of Civilizations. And we've certainly not seen the evidence of the decoupling that kind of the Atlantic article was saying is happening, at least in terms of on a scale that would be noticeable in some of the economic trends.
Yes. Yeah. I believe that brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and follow us on Twitter at Global Kellogg or me at AR Kellogg.
You can also reach us by email. So Nita at kelloggglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan, at kelloggglobalpolitics.com. And as always, please see the show notes for all the articles that we discussed in this episode and leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast provider.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.